The morning sun streamed through the large glass windows of a bustling corporate office in downtown Atlanta. David Carter stepped into the lobby, his every movement exuding calm confidence. His tailored suit, sharp and impeccably styled, caught the golden light, making him look every bit the successful professional he was. But today was no ordinary day, and the events that were about to unfold would forever alter how people in this office saw one another and themselves. The soft hum of keyboards and muted phone calls filled the air as the office's young receptionist, Sophie, glanced up from her desk. Her polished smile faltered the moment her eyes landed on David. Her gaze, once polite and professional, turned sharp with suspicion. She subtly tightened her grip on her phone, her demeanor shifting from welcoming to wary. David noticed the change but said nothing. He had encountered this silent judgment before, the kind of scrutiny that spoke louder than words ever could. He approached the desk with his usual composed demeanor, prepared to check in and proceed to his morning meeting. But Sophie's next move stopped him cold. "Excuse me," she said, her tone curt and clipped, her voice carrying just enough edge to catch the attention of those nearby. "Can I help you?" David gave her a small, patient smile. "Yes, I'm here for a meeting," he replied calmly. "My name is David Carter." Sophie's perfectly arched eyebrows knit together in visible disbelief. "David Carter?" she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism, as though the name itself didn't belong to the man standing before her. "I don't see your name on the list." David paused, sensing the weight behind her words. This wasn't just an oversight, it was an assumption. He adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, his calm expression unwavering. "That's because I don't need to be on a list," he explained, his voice steady. "I'm the owner of this company." A beat of silence passed, broken only by the muffled clicking of a keyboard somewhere nearby. Sophie's laugh, sharp and dismissive, cut through the air like a knife. "The owner?" she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. "You can't expect me to believe that." Around the room, a few curious heads turned. The low buzz of whispered conversations rippled through the office, the tension in the air growing heavier by the second. David stood his ground, his calm exterior betraying none of the frustration building inside him. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her expression a mixture of disbelief and defiance. Without even glancing at David's extended hand or the ID he held out, she motioned toward the nearby security guard. A silent command passed between them, and the guard, broad-shouldered and imposing, stepped forward. "Sir," the guard said gruffly, his voice carrying a note of authority, "I'm going to need you to step outside." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "There's no need for that," he said firmly. "I've already explained who I am." But neither Sophie nor the guard seemed interested in explanations. The guard took a step closer, his stance defensive, his tone more forceful. "You need to leave. Now." For a moment, David stood there, a silent battle raging inside him. He could feel the eyes of the entire office on him, some curious, some disapproving, and others simply indifferent. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but this was different. Being questioned, dismissed, and humiliated in a building he had worked so hard to create was a pain he hadn't expected to feel. His fists clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in restraint. Raising his voice or reacting with force would only validate the assumptions being made about him. Instead, he chose a different path. "You're making a mistake," David said, his voice calm but firm. "This is my company. I have every right to be here." The guard's expression hardened, and Sophie's smirk deepened as she crossed her arms over her chest. "If you don't leave," she said coldly, "I'll have no choice but to call the police." A hushed silence fell over the room. The weight of her threat hung heavy in the air, the words carrying a dangerous implication that David couldn't ignore. He scanned the faces around him, the silent spectators who chose to watch rather than intervene. Not one person spoke up. Not one person questioned Sophie's actions or the guard's hostility. Just then, the sound of an elevator chiming echoed through the lobby. The polished metal doors slid open, revealing a group of managers stepping out. Among them was a familiar face, someone who could put an end to this situation with a single word. The tension in the room shifted, every pair of eyes now fixed on the unfolding scene. David stood tall, his presence commanding attention as the managers approached. Sophie, still oblivious to the truth, straightened in her seat, preparing to explain the situation to her superiors. The guard stepped back slightly, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. And then one of the managers froze, his eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Carter?" he asked, his voice laced with shock and disbelief. The room went silent. Sophie's smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. The guard's bravado crumbled, and the office staff exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of the situation sinking in. David adjusted his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving Sophie's. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "It's me." The revelation hit like a thunderclap, leaving everyone stunned. And in that moment, the weight of their assumptions, judgments, and prejudices came crashing down. The weight of David's words seemed to echo in the silence that followed, reverberating off the pristine walls of the office lobby. Sophie's lips parted as though to say something, but no words came out. Her polished confidence, the same one she had wielded like a weapon just moments before, now seemed fragile, cracking under the heavy realization of her mistake. The guard shifted uncomfortably, his earlier aggression replaced by a clumsy awkwardness. David took a slow, measured breath, keeping his composure even as a storm of emotions brewed inside him. He had always known that prejudice could show up anywhere, even in the very spaces he had built. But to feel its sting so acutely, to have his presence questioned in a place that existed because of his vision and hard work, was a wound that cut deeper than he could have imagined. The manager who had recognized David stepped forward, his face pale, his demeanor noticeably nervous. "Mr. Carter," he said again, this time with a shaky smile, as though hoping to undo the damage with his tone alone. I had no idea you were coming today." David turned his gaze to the man but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his silence speak, allowing the weight of the moment to press down on everyone who had stood by and done nothing. Sophie cleared her throat, the sound too loud and awkward in the quiet room. I didn't realize," she began, her voice faltering as she stumbled over her words. David finally looked at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "Didn't realize what?" he asked, his tone even but carrying an edge that made her fumble further. "I didn't realize who you were," Sophie admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She glanced at the security guard, as if seeking support, but he avoided her eyes, suddenly very interested in the floor. David raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "And what exactly about me made you so sure I wasn't the owner?" he asked, his question cutting straight to the heart of the issue. Sophie opened her mouth, but no answer came. Instead, she looked away, her earlier certainty replaced by visible regret. The silence that followed was thick with tension, broken only by the faint hum of office equipment and the whispered murmurs of employees watching from a distance. The manager, desperate to regain some sense of control, stepped in again. "I'm sure this is all just a big misunderstanding," he said quickly, his forced smile doing little to ease the tension. David's eyes narrowed, his calm exterior finally giving way to a hint of the frustration simmering beneath. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice still measured but sharper now. "It wasn't a misunderstanding when I walked in here and was judged before I could even say a word." The manager stammered, clearly unsure of how to respond. Sophie shifted in her chair, visibly uncomfortable, while the security guard stood awkwardly to the side, his earlier bravado entirely gone. "I've spent years building this company," David continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his words. "Years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifices. And yet, when I walk into my own building, I'm treated like I don't belong." The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his words. No one dared to speak, the silence stretching long enough to become suffocating. David finally turned his attention back to Sophie, who was now nervously twisting her hands in her lap. "Tell me something," he said, his tone softer but no less firm. "When you saw me walk in, what did you see?" Sophie hesitated, her gaze flickering to the manager as if hoping he would intervene. But when no help came, she looked back at David, her face flushed with embarrassment. I don't know," she admitted quietly, I guess I just assumed. David didn't let her finish. You assumed, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made her flinch. You assumed I didn't belong here, that I couldn't possibly be the owner. And why? Because I didn't fit the image you had in your mind. Sophie swallowed hard, her face pale now. She tried to speak again, but David held up a hand, stopping her. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice firm but calm. It's about how easily we let our assumptions guide us, how quick we are to judge based on what we see instead of who someone is. The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on everyone in the room. David's gaze swept over the office staff, taking in their averted eyes and uneasy expressions. He knew this moment wasn't just about calling out one person's prejudice, it was about holding a mirror up to the entire company. The manager finally broke the silence, his voice trembling slightly. Mr. Carter, I assure you, this is not reflective of our company's values. We deeply regret. David cut him off with a raised hand. Regret doesn't change what happened, he said simply. Actions do. The manager nodded quickly, his expression one of nervous agreement. Sophie, meanwhile, looked as though she wished the ground would swallow her whole. The guard, still standing awkwardly by the door, glanced between David and the manager, his discomfort evident. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had no intention of letting anger control him. This moment was too important for that. I'm not here to lecture anyone, he said finally, his voice calm but firm. But I hope this serves as a wake-up call. Bias doesn't just hurt the people it's directed at, it holds all of us back. If we want this company to succeed, we have to be better. All of us. With that, he turned and walked toward the elevator, his stride steady and purposeful. The lobby remained silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. As he stepped into the elevator and the doors began to close, David caught a glimpse of the faces behind him. Some stunned, some ashamed, but all undeniably changed by what had just happened. This wasn't the end of the story, David knew. It was just the beginning. Change was never easy, but if this moment sparked even the smallest shift in perspective, it would be worth it. As the elevator began its ascent, David allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Sometimes the most powerful victories were the quiet ones. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft hum, cutting David off from the tense lobby he had just left. He leaned back against the cool steel wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment as the weight of the encounter settled over him. For years, he had learned to navigate moments like this, but no amount of experience could dull the sting entirely. It wasn't just about him. It was about everything his journey represented. As the elevator climbed, David thought back to how it all started. He had built this company with nothing but determination, a bold vision, and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Every success had been earned through countless setbacks, skepticism, and quiet victories. Yet, moments like this reminded him that some battles weren't fought in boardrooms or strategy meetings. They were fought in hearts and minds. When the elevator stopped, the doors opened to reveal the executive floor. The spacious, modern design reflected the ambition David had poured into his work. Yet, as he stepped out, a lingering frustration clung to him. He had to address what had happened downstairs, but the question remained, how? In the conference room, a meeting with his senior team was already underway. The team fell silent as David entered, their expressions shifting from casual to alert. At the head of the table, Karen, his sharp-witted chief operations officer, gave him a curious look. "You're late," she said with a teasing smile, but her tone softened when she saw his face. "Everything okay?" David set his briefcase on the table and took a seat, his usual calm demeanor masking the storm beneath. "We'll get to business in a minute," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "But first, I need to talk about something that just happened downstairs." Karen's smile faded as concern flickered across her face. The rest of the team exchanged glances, sensing the shift in tone. David recounted the incident in the lobby, his words measured but clear. He left nothing out: the dismissive glance, the guard's hostility, Sophie's cutting laughter. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Karen looked appalled, her sharp eyes narrowing in disbelief. "In our lobby?" she asked, her voice laced with incredulity. To you? David nodded. It's not the first time I've experienced something like this, he said. But it's the first time it's happened here, in a place I built. And that's what makes it unacceptable. The team listened intently as David explained how moments like these weren't isolated. They were reflections of deeper issues. Prejudice wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it was the quiet assumptions people made without even realizing it. Karen leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. We need to address this head-on, she said firmly, not just with Sophie and the guard, but with the entire staff. If this kind of behavior is happening under our roof, it's a problem we all own. David appreciated her directness. Karen had been with him from the early days, and he trusted her instincts. Agreed, he said. But this isn't just about issuing a memo or holding a training session. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't come from ticking boxes. Karen nodded in agreement. It starts with accountability, she said. And we need to set the tone from the top. As the meeting shifted to brainstorming solutions, David's mind wandered back to the faces he had seen in the lobby, the silent onlookers who had chosen not to intervene. It wasn't just Sophie or the guard. It was the culture that allowed moments like this to go unchallenged. After the meeting, David returned to his office, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city he had come to call home. The skyline was a reminder of how far he had come. But today, it also felt like a challenge, one he couldn't ignore. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, drafting an email to the entire company. His words were deliberate, striking a balance between addressing the incident and inviting reflection. He didn't name names or assign blame, but he made it clear that the company had to do better. As he typed, David couldn't shake the memory of Sophie's expression when she realized who he was. The shock, the embarrassment, the regret. It was all so human, yet it didn't excuse what had happened. He wondered what she was feeling now. Was she reflecting on her actions, or was she too caught up in her own discomfort to truly understand their impact? Meanwhile, downstairs, the office was buzzing with whispered conversations about the incident. Word had spread quickly, and Sophie found herself the reluctant center of attention. She avoided eye contact, keeping her focus on her computer as she replayed the scene in her mind. For Sophie, the realization of her mistake wasn't just humiliating, it was deeply unsettling. She had always thought of herself as fair and professional, someone who treated everyone equally. But today, she had acted on an assumption, and the consequences had been undeniable. The security guard, too, was grappling with his own feelings of regret. His aggressive stance and dismissive attitude toward David now felt like a glaring misstep. He wondered how he could have handled the situation differently, but the weight of his actions hung heavy on him. As the day went on, the atmosphere in the office grew tense. People whispered in hushed tones, their curiosity mingling with unease. Some felt guilty for not stepping in. Others questioned their own biases, wondering how they might have reacted in Sophie's place. Back in his office, David stared out at the city, his thoughts racing. He knew that today's events were just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Change wouldn't come easily, but it was necessary. And it had to start here, with him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the office, the tension within the building reached a palpable high. David's email had circulated, and everyone had read it. The usually bustling office floor was quieter than normal, as if the weight of his words had settled into every corner. People whispered cautiously, avoiding the possibility of being overheard. Sophie sat stiffly at her desk, her hands hovering above her keyboard, unsure of what to do. The email hadn't called her out by name, but everyone knew. Her colleagues cast fleeting glances her way, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity, judgment, and pity. The weight of their scrutiny was almost unbearable, but what gnawed at Sophie more was her own sense of shame. She wanted to apologize, but the words didn't come. What could she say to erase what had already been done? The security guard wasn't faring much better. He avoided the lobby as much as he could, taking an uncharacteristic number of breaks in the back room. Each time he replayed the confrontation in his head, his stomach tightened. His pride and defensiveness from earlier were now replaced by a gnawing regret. But he didn't know how to fix it. David, however, was far from done. After the email, he had instructed Karen to organize an emergency meeting with the entire staff. Word of the meeting spread quickly, adding to the already thick tension in the air. No one knew exactly what to expect, but the anticipation was enough to keep everyone on edge. As the time for the meeting approached, employees began filing into the large conference room. Conversations were hushed, with a nervous energy rippling through the crowd. Sophie sat in the back, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her heart pounded as she tried to prepare herself for what was to come, though she had no idea how the meeting would unfold. When David entered the room, the quiet murmurs ceased. He stood at the front, his presence commanding attention without him needing to say a word. Karen stood beside him, her expression unreadable but supportive. David scanned the room, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "I've called this meeting because today something happened that can't be ignored," he began, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "It wasn't just about me. It was about what we allow to happen in this workplace, and by extension, in our lives." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Every pair of eyes was fixed on David as he continued. He didn't single anyone out but spoke about the culture they had built and the gaps they had allowed to form. He challenged them to reflect on their own biases and how those biases could shape their actions in ways they might not even realize. "The truth is," David said, his tone unwavering, "we all have blind spots. We all make assumptions, but what defines us is what we do when those blind spots are revealed. Do we double down, or do we choose to learn and grow?" Sophie's throat tightened as his words landed heavily on her. She wanted to sink into her chair, to disappear entirely, but at the same time, she couldn't look away. David paused, letting the silence stretch. "I want this company to be a place where everyone feels valued, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. And that starts with accountability." The employees shifted in their seats, the weight of his words sinking in. Some nodded subtly, while others stared at their hands, lost in thought. "And so," David continued, his voice steady but firm, "there will be changes, not just in policies or procedures, but in how we approach our work and each other. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. It's overdue." The tension in the room was almost unbearable now, the air thick with unspoken questions. Everyone was waiting, wondering how David would handle what had happened. Whether he would call out Sophie and the guard directly or if he had another plan in mind. "I'm not here to shame anyone," David said, his voice softening but still carrying its impact. "That's not how we grow. But I do expect accountability and a commitment to do better." He let those words hang in the air, looking out at the room, his expression unreadable. Sophie felt her chest tighten further. Accountability. The word echoed in her mind, heavy with meaning. As David wrapped up his speech, the tension didn't dissipate, it lingered, filling the spaces between every person in the room. The meeting ended, but the weight of what had been said stayed with everyone as they slowly filed out. Sophie stayed behind, unable to move. She watched as David gathered his things and spoke quietly with Karen before starting to leave. Her heart pounded as she made a decision she had been avoiding all day. Rising from her seat, she followed him out of the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they were finally alone in the hallway, she cleared her throat, her voice trembling. "Mr. Carter," she said, her words barely above a whisper. David stopped and turned to face her, his expression calm but unreadable. Sophie's breath caught as she looked into his eyes, feeling the full weight of what she had done. She began, but the words failed her. She swallowed hard, her hands twisting together nervously. "I need to apologize. For earlier, for how I acted. It was wrong. I made assumptions, and I shouldn't have." David's gaze didn't waver, and for a moment, Sophie wasn't sure how he would respond. Her chest tightened as the silence stretched, the weight of her own words pressing down on her. This was the moment she had dreaded all day, and she had no idea what would come next. David held Sophie's gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence between them felt like it stretched endlessly, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound. Sophie's heart raced as she braced herself for his response. unsure if he would accept her apology or dismiss her entirely. Finally, David sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you for saying that," he said quietly, his voice measured but firm. "Acknowledging the mistake is the first step, but actions matter more than words." Sophie nodded quickly, her face flushed with relief and embarrassment. "I know," she stammered. I want to do better. I will do better." David studied her for another moment, then gave a small nod. "I hope so," he said simply. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Sophie standing in the empty hallway. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that he hadn't lashed out at her, guilt for her actions, and a deep-seated determination to prove that she could be better. As David walked back to his office, his mind was racing. Sophie's apology was a start, but it didn't erase what had happened. The incident had opened his eyes to just how deeply ingrained the biases in his workplace were, and he knew that a single speech or policy change wouldn't be enough to fix it. He needed to do more, to make sure that no one else would ever have to experience what he had that morning. But just as he reached his office door, Karen appeared, her face pale and her eyes wide with worry. "David," she said, her voice urgent. "We've got a problem." David frowned, his heart sinking. "What is it?" he asked, stepping aside to let her into the office. Karen closed the door behind her and handed him a tablet. On the screen was a video, the title glaring back at him. "CEO accuses staff of racism. Explosive confrontation goes viral." David's stomach dropped as he pressed play. The video was a grainy, shaky recording taken on someone's phone, capturing the heated exchange between him, Sophie, and the security guard in the lobby. It didn't show the full context of the incident, but the clip had been edited to make it seem even more dramatic. As the video played, David's anger and frustration grew. He could see the smug expressions of those who had stood by, filming instead of stepping in to help. He could hear the murmurs of the onlookers, their voices full of amusement and disdain, and he could see his own face, the calm he had fought so hard to maintain, starting to crack under the weight of the moment. "It's everywhere," Karen said, her voice tight with concern. "It's all over social media, and news outlets are starting to pick it up. People are commenting, sharing, speculating." She trailed off, her eyes searching his face for a reaction. David set the tablet down with a sigh, his mind racing. The last thing he had wanted was for this to become a public spectacle. He had hoped to handle the situation internally, to use it as a teachable moment for his team. But now it was out of his hands. "We need to address this," Karen said, breaking the silence. "People are demanding a statement. Some are even threatening to boycott the company." David nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "But first, I want to find out who leaked this video." Karen hesitated, then nodded. "I'll start looking into it," she said. "But David, you should know, this might get worse before it gets better." David gave her a faint smile, his eyes weary but resolute. "I faced worse," he said simply. As Karen left to begin her investigation, David sat down at his desk, his mind racing. He knew that addressing the video would be tricky. He couldn't let his emotions take over. But he also couldn't let the narrative spiral out of control. He needed to strike the right balance, to show strength and accountability without feeding into the sensationalism. But just as he began drafting a statement, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Frowning, he answered the call. "Mr. Carter?" A woman's voice said, her tone cautious but urgent. "Yes, this is David Carter," he replied. "Who's this?" "My name is Maya," the woman said. "I'm a reporter with Asterisk, the Tribune Asterisk. I'm calling because I've been investigating a pattern of discrimination at your company, and the video that surfaced today confirms some of the things I've been hearing. I'd like to get your side of the story before publishing my piece." David's grip on the phone tightened. "Discrimination?" he repeated, his voice sharp. "Yes," Maya said. "Several current and former employees have come forward with allegations of bias and unfair treatment. They claim that the culture at your company allows these behaviors to go unchecked. Would you care to comment?" David's mind reeled as he processed her words. Allegations? Bias? This wasn't just about the incident in the lobby. It was something much bigger, something he hadn't even realized was happening under his watch. I need some time to look into this, he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. But I assure you, I take these claims very seriously. Please send me your questions, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Of course, Maya said. I'll send over an email. But Mr. Carter, this story is moving quickly. I suggest you act fast. As the call ended, David set his phone down, his hands trembling slightly. The stakes had just been raised, and the spotlight on him and his company had grown even brighter. The video was no longer just an isolated incident. It was a catalyst for something much larger. David knew that the next steps he took would define not only his leadership but the future of his company. And as he stared out the window at the city skyline, he realized that this wasn't just a challenge, it was a reckoning. David sat in his office, his thoughts heavy as he stared at the email Maya had sent. It was detailed, filled with allegations from employees he had once trusted and others he barely remembered. The accusations ranged from microaggressions to systemic bias in hiring and promotions. He scrolled through the document, his heart sinking with every paragraph. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a one-off incident. It was a culture problem, and it had happened under his leadership. Karen knocked softly on his door, stepping inside when he gestured for her to enter. I've identified the source of the video, she said quietly. It was one of the interns. They said they didn't mean for it to go viral. They just shared it with a friend, and it spiraled out of control. David nodded, barely registering her words. His focus was elsewhere. We need to call a company-wide meeting, he said. Today, I want everyone there.